Good afternoon. Welcome to another weekly edition of the Wrap. I'm Travis Fain, part of WRAL's state government team.
And I'm Bryan Anderson, also part of WRAL state government team.
Yeah, we got a busy week to go through here. I try not to take too much of your time, but there were some important hearings at the legislature this week on the Cooper administration's ability or lack thereof to help people quickly who lost their homes in hurricanes Florence and Matthew. We're now obviously quite a few years from those storm events, but people whose homes are being rebuilt through a federally funded program that runs through the state. So, two levels of bureaucracy have been waiting a long time. Lisa Sorg at NC Policy Watch has done a ton of good work on this. And if you haven't read those stories, I would encourage you to do so. They'll be easy to find online. It's kind of a mess, Bryan, and I know this wasn't your story, but I imagine you followed it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you have hurricane victims who have been having their homes destroyed, just waiting. I've seen people who have been waiting 6 years and very minimal progress, it's just for many residents an inexcusable situation.
Yeah, and I want to look anytime, as I said on Twitter, a Republican run legislature and Lisa Sorg, who is probably the state's preeminent environmental reporter, also a great environmentalist, and works for Left Leaning Policy Watch. When those two sides agree that there's a problem, you got a good bet there's a problem. And to quote Lisa's story, yesterday, Thursday, bureaucratic snafus, arbitrary decision making, inconsistent protocols, and even arrogance in Rebuild NC's top leadership have inflicted dire consequences on thousands of people. There's no ambivalence in that statement. Some of this is federal, though. There's something called authorization. So, Ryan, when new money gets authorized, it's not just enough that Congress votes. The agency that runs it, in this case HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, has to write all these rules. And that takes months. We saw this during the pandemic, too, with quote unquote emergency programs with hundreds of millions and billions of dollars that Congress would pass. The money wouldn't get released to the states to do their part for months because all these rules had to be written to. Senator Tom Tillis is working to address this with the CDBGR CDBGDR money, disaster relief money that we're talking about here, that is meant to rebuild people's homes and is meant to take kind of a long time to spend anyway. That's the pot of money we're talking about here. But we can cut out months, maybe a year on the front end, if instead of making HUD write rules every time one of these grant packages gets okayed, it just becomes an authorized program so that the rules are roughly the same every time. Like I said, Senator Tillis has got a bill to do that. Others have bill to do that, but it's just part of a broader bipartisan discussion at the federal level. And that's before we get to the state level. But
Yeah, I mean, the point being, if it's an emergency, most people associate emergency with imminence and immediacy. Months and even a year upwards is not immediate for people.
yeah, nobody disputes that we can cut out some of this red tape. Nobody that I've seen, at least. So, let's do that. You broke a little news today, Bryan. I mean, I guess it was kind of one of the worst kept secrets in North Carolina politics. But you got the man himself to say it. Tell us what Dale Folwell's thinking about.
Yeah, I broke the news that has been chatter for a while, but not actually spoken by the man himself, on the record at least, until recently. So I recently spoke with North Carolina Republican State Treasurer Dale Folwell. He's been rumored to be considering a run for governor in 2024, where he would presumably face Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, who has pretty much all but announced his run at this point. He's previously said he's 95% likely to do it, would announce maybe around after thinking about it over this year's holidays. But for Folwell, it's very interesting. He said he's going to be trying to he would campaign on a message of results, and in his words, not rage, which is alluding to Lieutenant Governor Robinson's history of insulting comments on political opponents, the LGBTQ community, a number of people. And so what Folwell's trying to do here is, in his view, return to the word conserve in conservative politics, sort of going back to, fiscal responsibility messages. I mean, he's the stiff policy guy. Robinson is not the stiff policy guy. So that would make for an interesting contrast. And I just looked, hey, what's the recent history of competitive races? And in 2008, there was a Republican gubernatorial primary between State Senator Fred Smith, I believe, and former or then Charlotte Mayor Pat McCrory. And so that was a competitive contest, but not between two existing statewide office holders. So there is certainly precedent in North Carolina. We saw it with just this election cycle for the U.S. Senate having competitive primaries and intra-party fights among Republicans, but at the gubernatorial level hasn't really happened in the last 15 years, and certainly not at the level of Folwell and Robinson primary would be.
Yeah, and I mean, Folwell ran for lieutenant governor against Dan Forrest. I can't remember what year that would have been. I mean, several years ago, certainly before he was treasurer, and now Folwell has won, I believe, 2 statewide elections as treasurer. But, with Forrest and Folwell, you had, like you said, the straight-laced policy guy in Folwell, kind of boring, but interesting. I mean, the man rides motorcycles, or did up until he recently broke his arm in his 60s or however he is. So, I mean,
how boring can you be if you do that?
How boring can you be? Right, right. He also calls the hospitals in this state cartels, so he's willing to throw a few bombs of his own. There is some populism to his message, but Dan Forrest, who was very good in a room, very polished. Republicans picked him overwhelmingly in the lieutenant governor's race over Dale Folwell. I think Folwell would have a similar problem this time out, but we shall see.
I should note really quick, we just spoke recently with, someone who has been calling on Folwell to run. Folwell said he had been urged by basically a group of state workers, State Employees Association.
Seen it, yeah.
Yeah. And Artis Watkins is the head of that group. She's been a lobbyist in the Capitol for north of 2 decades, very influential person. And so I was told Watkins has encouraged Folwell to run. So I talked to Watkins today. We're recording on Friday, and she told me, quote, "I don't know Mark Robinson, and I don't remember a time that our membership has discussed him. He's not on the radar as far as our organization." So some pretty damning commentary from her to not just say we back Folwell, but that Robinson doesn't really have the ties to the 46,000 state past and present workers who her group represents. So it's a vocal contingency and an important group in an election cycle, but everybody I've spoken with really considers Robinson the favorite.
Yeah, that's the general wisdom. And Folwell as treasurer oversees the state health plan, so he's going to work closely with Scenic on those issues at the legislature and in state government in general. Speaking of statewide elections, we are going to get at least one debate between U.S. Senate candidates, Sherry Beasley and Ted Budd, October 7th, Spectrum. There we go. We finally got one.
Nothing spreads awareness like a Friday afternoon debate in North Carolina politics. Technically, 1 month and a day away from the election, so it's might not even be on voters' radar. That even, I guess you want to say, that far out. I mean, it's pretty close to the election, but we've seen shorter and shorter attention spans in recent election cycles, and a lot of voters may have better things to do on their Friday nights than watch a Senate debate. But we've been waiting for a long time for this. The real question was, would Budd agree? He skipped out on 4 primary debates, as people will remember, and there was some questions of whether that strategy would continue into the general. Sherry Beasley agreed to an Association of Broadcasters debate as well. We should note that. So Beasley agreed to 2, Budd agreed to 1, which was the Spectrum news debate. So here we are, where there's a debate.
Yeah, speaking of Budd, he's a co-sponsor in the U.S. House of the Republican post 15-week ban on abortions with some limited exceptions. That's kind of the new bar for discussion. This is the same bill that Senator Lindsey Graham has in the United States Senate. So that that there's kind of a coalescing Republican position that 15 weeks will be the cutoff. Obviously, Democrats and Beasley do not support that. And, Paul Shoemaker, longtime Republican consultant, out with some polling this week, the upshot of which was, hey, guys, abortion probably not the best election issue for us, so you might want to calculate that into your calculus, Republican candidates.
Yeah, I mean, you would think Democrats' strongest messaging is abortion, Republicans' strongest messaging is, inflation, economy concerns. So why not just, if you just, both sides would seemingly feel comfortable sticking to that, but Republicans taking up abortion has the potential to animate their own party. It also has the potential to anger far more Democrats than it would win Republicans.
Yeah, along the lines of animation, next weekend, starting Friday night, the former president, Donald Trump, he'll be in Wilmington. We learned yesterday that Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, the extremely controversial Congresswoman out of Georgia, will be in Wake County speaking to the Wake County Republican Party at a gala they're having. And it's also the Salt and Light Conference. So Trey Gowdy, Lauren Boebert, Mark Robinson will be speaking at the Salt and Light Conference in Charlotte. So we just, for far right Republican politics, we are kind of the center of the universe next weekend.
Yeah, one thing I should contrast that with is, there are some other races that are notable. One of the more boring but important ones is the Supreme Court race. Certainly no Marjorie Taylor Greene-like personalities in those contests, but you have Sam Ervin, the sitting Democratic state Supreme Court Associate Justice, running against Trey Allen, who was appointed by Republican Chief Justice Paul Newby to sort of offer administrative guidance to court officials. And so that's probably the more fiery / contentious race of the two that are up for grabs. And basically both sides are trying to make the case that they would be more likely to be consensus builders in a Supreme Court that's seen some reputational damage with tight 4-3 rulings and high-profile cases like redistricting. The other race there is 2 Court of Appeals judges, with Lucy Inman running on the Democratic side and Richard Dietz running on the Republican side. They're probably more similar than Ervin and Allen would be, but a key difference is, just how much are you willing to let the state legislature's written language carry out at the end of the day. Inman seems more receptive to kind of understanding a little bit more of the intent, and Richard Dietz is more matter of fact. Just look at the express language of the law, and if it's not absolutely vague, we shouldn't have a role in overriding it.
Yeah, and we're getting quite a few forums at the Supreme Court level. You've covered 2, at least one of which I think streamed online, so people can, kind of Google that up and find it. On the Record, which is WRAL's Saturday evening program, he runs either 7 or 7:30. It shifts sometimes. Will be about Supreme Court races. We've got all 4 candidates there. So educate yourselves, or you know what, just vote for the Republican or the Democrat. That's what it seems to come down to.
Let's go with readnccapital.com and try and be an informed voter here. I mean,
all right, that's speaking of our state Supreme Court, I will note quickly they agreed to take up one of the 3 voter ID cases that is still pending on what a law we passed in either 2018 or 2019. They'll take that up in October, so before a new court would be elected. A lot of people see that as the Democratic majority that may not be a Democratic majority after November, wanting to move more quickly on that.
And the court just quickly is 4-3 Democratic majority. Republicans just need one of 2 seats up for grabs to reclaim that.
All right. And let's turn our attention maybe to Medicaid expansion. Not any huge update, like it's not imminent or any more imminent. But I will note, viewers or listeners will note that the SAVE Act, which would give nurses more scope of practice, would allow them to do more things without having to have paperwork signed by a doctor. Supervision by paperwork is what the Nursing Association will call it. The SAVE Act has been package with certificate of need reform, which affects how hospitals can and cannot expand. It limits competition in the hospital sector. That has all been part and parcel of a Senate-backed proposal to expand Medicaid in North Carolina after more than a decade of North Carolina not expanding it. The architect of that was Phil Berger, Senate President Pro Tem. I will note that he got the North Carolina Nursing Association Legislator of the Year award this week, as did Gail Adcock, who is a Democrat in the House and a nurse.
Who would have had that on their scorecard 2 years ago?
Right. As far as whether or not we're any further along the path on Medicaid expansion, there was a letter from UNC Medical School Dean Wesley Burks, who is also the head of UNC Health, so a major player in healthcare in North Carolina, who said we have made great strides forward in the last few months on Medicaid expansion, and quote, I am optimistic that the legislature can move a bill forward before the year comes to a close. Now, that was in response to some students that were pushing UNC Health to push the North Carolina Hospital Association to back off its opposition to certificate of need reforms so that the Senate's Medicaid expansion bill can move forward. And I'm thinking maybe this podcast is not the best venue to explain the ins and outs of Medicaid expansion, Bryan.
The bottom line, it's a mess. And we'll see what happens. There's certainly been some chatter, particularly from more of maybe taking up a lighter version this bill of that Medicaid expansion bill this year. Berger hasn't expressed much interest in that, and maybe this will come down to what the election results are and what the makeup of the legislature next year would be. So maybe between November 9th and the end of December you get something, but it's not looking great today.
A lame duck session certainly would not surprise me on this and or other issues. I spoke to Berger yesterday, so Thursday of this week, and he said the entire package, quote, is what's important. Everything that's in the Senate package needs to be passed. Said he didn't sense any movement from hospitals who oppose certificate of need reform or from doctors who are against the SAVE Act, the thing about nurses that we talked about a little bit. Berger said he's willing to negotiate on details there, quote, but it's not a negotiation that's going to be successful if the other side basically says no. Also talked to the governor about this stuff this week. He said that, he of course supports Medicaid expansion. He said that he hears more talk about certificate of need reform than the SAVE Act in those negotiations, to the extent that they're going on now. But Senator Berger telling me that both are crucial as far as the state Senate is concerned.
Absolutely.
Let's see what else here. I got a couple of quick ones. The Mark Meadows investigation continues 6 months after Charles Bethia at the New Yorker made it pretty clear that Mark Meadows was not living at the location that he listed on his voter registration form when he voted. There was a story in the Asheville Citizen Times this week that reached out to the State Bureau of Investigation, and they said, yeah, we're still investigating that. No further comment, which is standard in those cases. I guess my point is 6 months seemed like a long time to figure out whether or not somebody was living where they said they were.
I mean, the State Board of Elections already figured it out when they removed Meadows from the voter rolls there, and made him no longer active. So that didn't take very much time.
Sure, and that's prospective versus looking back in time to the time of that election. But as I said on Twitter, give me subpoena power. See if it takes me 6 months. I will accept.
I would not vote for give Travis Payne subpoena power. I would not back that bill.
I don't know. I'll also note this is not a fully formed thing, but the NCAE, the Association of Educators, back in like 2014, give or take, the legislature, Republicans passed a law that said unless you had 40,000, if you're an education organization like that, unless you have 40,000 members, you can't do automatic deduction from your paycheck for dues. So it makes it harder for organizations like the NCAE, which has been opposed to Republican policies in the legislature, to get members to pay dues because they can't get dues check off unless they hit that 40,000 target. So the state auditor was told, all right, every year you got to ask all these organizations how many members they have. And a bunch of organizations gave it to the state auditor because they weren't in danger of losing dues checkoff, but the NCAE was. So they never gave up the number until this year. And I don't know what has changed, But in the latest report that the auditor sends out, the NCAE is listed a membership of 26,000 people. I can't get NCAE on the phone to tell me why they changed here. So that's something we're watching. I don't know what it means yet, but I am trying to shake it loose. So if you know something, world, please do let me know. I think that's all I want to get into this week. The governor likes Diet Sun Drop. Go to Twitter if you don't know what I'm talking about.
Cheerwine is far superior, and that's your fact check from me.
Well, I mean that's bold, but I would also argue that that's apples to oranges, because Cheerwine, I mean, that is an extremely and exceedingly specific. And I would say though, it is the king and or queen of North Carolina carbonated beverages.
For sure. And I'll just say, leave folks with this. Just say, check NC Capital out this weekend. You won't want to miss it. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, Bryan's got a little something coming that ain't little. So everybody have a good day, a good weekend, and we wish you the best.